Sometimes a woman crosses oceans, deserts, and death itself to build a better life, only to end up trapped in a house where the silence is louder than the screams. It is a specific kind of cage, one built not with iron bars, but with threats, isolation, and the crushing weight of a life hidden behind closed doors. Today, I am telling you the story of Elena. She spent years navigating the impossible to reach a place she believed would offer safety. She crossed borders, outran shadows, and survived the kind of trials that break most people. She arrived with nothing but a dream and the raw, unyielding intent to survive. She thought she had found a savior in a new country. She was wrong. She found a prison. The house looked perfect from the street. The lights were always on. The lawn was always mowed. And the neighbors saw only a quiet, settled life. But inside, every room was a cell. Elena learned that the hardest walls to break are not the ones you face when you arrive, but the ones you wake up to every single morning. She was a ghost in her own kitchen, waiting for a door to open that never would. The boat was a splintered shell against the Atlantic. It groaned with every impact, the wood shivering as the waves hammered the hull. Elena sat in the dark, pressed against the wet timber, her knuckles white. She held a small photograph of her family against her chest, pressing it deep into her skin as if the paper could shield her from the salt and the spray. The water rose. It sloshed over the sides, freezing and heavy. She did not scream. She prayed to a God she hoped was still listening, her lips moving silently while the vessel pitched into the abyss. Every time the bow dipped, the ocean threatened to swallow them whole. She felt the tilt of the world, the sickening drop of the floor, and the roar of the wind drowning out all thought. She locked her gaze on the image in her hand. The faces in the frame were her only anchor. She fought the urge to close her eyes, watching the horizon for a flicker of light that refused to appear. The boat shuddered, water pouring over the gunwales, and she shifted her weight to keep the balance. She was not going to sink here. The keel scraped against sand, a harsh, grating sound that signaled the end of the roar. Elena tumbled forward, her palms digging into the grit, the impact jarring her bones. She did not wait for the others. She scrambled onto the beach, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that tasted of salt and cold air. Her hands were raw, the skin split and stained with brine, but she didn't look at them. She looked at the horizon. The sun was beginning to bleed color into the sky, casting long golden fingers across the dunes. She stood up, her knees trembling, and took a step forward. The ground beneath her was steady. It did not pitch, it did not groan, and it did not threaten to pull her under. She exhaled, a long, shivering sound that emptied the last of the terror from her lungs. She reached into her pocket, felt the edges of the photograph, and knew she had won. The desert, the sea. The night spent starving, they were behind her. She walked toward the tree line, her heart swelling with a fierce, absolute hope. She was here. She was safe. The nightmare was finally over. The city was a labyrinth of noise and indifferent faces. Elena walked for hours, her feet aching, scanning the storefronts for a sign of work or a place to rest. The hope that had carried her across the sea began to fray under the weight of the concrete reality. She sat on a park bench, shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun. When a shadow fell across her, a man stopped. He did not rush. He did not stare. He simply offered a bottle of water and a slow, steady nod. This was Gary. He spoke with a quiet precision, his voice lacking the sharp edges she had encountered everywhere else. He asked about her journey, not with pity, but with a focused intensity that made her feel seen for the first time in months. He spoke of stability, of a house with a locked door, and of the safety he could provide. He listened as she whispered her story, his head tilted, his hands resting still on his knees. He promised to clear the path ahead, to bridge the distance between her past and a future she could call her own. She watched his eyes, waiting for the flicker of deceit, but found only a calm, unwavering assurance. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. The weeks that followed were a blur of small, deliberate gestures. Gary brought her meals before she asked. He navigated the bureaucracy of her situation with a quiet, tireless efficiency, that made the world seem less hostile. Every evening, he would sit across from her, outlining a future that had no room for the hunger or the fear that had defined her previous years. He spoke of a house on the outskirts of the city, a place where the locks held and the nights were quiet. Elena listened, her pulse steadying for the first time in her life. She stopped looking over her shoulder when she walked down the street. She stopped keeping her documents tucked inside her shoe. One rainy Tuesday, he knelt in the center of their living room. He did not talk about her past or the ocean. He spoke only of the next 40 years. He reached out, his palms open, and asked her to join her life to his. She saw the end of the road she had been traveling. She saw the end of the running. She reached down, took his hands, and said yes. In that moment, the shadows of the desert and the salt of the sea felt like a dream that had finally been washed away. The ceremony was small, held in the sterile quiet of a government office. When the ring slid onto her finger, the metal felt heavier than she expected, a cold band of gold against her skin. Elena looked up, waiting for the familiar softness in Gary's eyes, the warmth that had anchored her for weeks. It was gone. He stood, his shoulders squaring, his gaze turning flat and clinical. The hand that had held hers just moments ago dropped to his side, limp and disinterested. He turned toward the door without waiting for her, his pace brisk, his stride purposeful. She stood frozen, the weight of the ring pulling at her hand, watching his back as he walked away. He did not look back to check if she was following. He did not offer a hand to guide her through the crowd. He simply kept walking, leaving her to navigate the hallway alone. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. She took a breath, expecting the usual comfort of his voice to fill the space, but he remained silent. He reached the exit, pushed the heavy door open, and waited. His face was a mask of indifference. The man who had promised to protect her was gone, replaced by a stranger who owned the space she occupied. Back at the house, the silence was absolute. Gary moved through the rooms with a heavy, deliberate gait that made the floorboards groan. When Elena tried to ask about the paperwork he had promised to file, he did not answer. He poured a glass of water, drank it slowly, and set the glass down with a sharp click. He walked toward her, closing the distance until she could feel the heat radiating from him. He stopped inches away, his shadow falling across her face. He did not raise his voice. He leaned in, his mouth close to her ear, and spoke with a terrifying, measured clarity. "You are only here because I allow it," he whispered. "Every breath you take in this house is a gift I have granted you." He pulled back just enough to watch her eyes. His expression remained unreadable, a mask of cold authority. "One phone call to the authorities is all it takes to end your life here. You are nothing without me." He turned on his heel and walked into the study, leaving her standing in the center of the room. She stood motionless, her hands trembling, the weight of his words pinning her to the floor. The trap had finally snapped shut. The kitchen became the perimeter of her world. Elena scrubbed the counters until the wood grains stood out under the harsh overhead light. She moved in a tight, repetitive circle, wiped the stove, checked the sink, organized the spice rack by height. Every action was measured to avoid making noise. When Gary entered, the atmosphere shifted instantly. He did not look at her. He walked to the center of the room, picked up a plate she had just dried, and inspected it for water spots. He held it up to the light, then dropped it back onto the counter with a clatter. "You never quite get it clean, do you?" he said, his voice cutting through the hum of the refrigerator. He paced behind her, commenting on the way she handled the utensils, mocking the rhythm of her movements. He mimicked her accent, twisting her own words into sharp, jagged barbs. Elena kept her head down. She gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white, refusing to meet his eyes. She focused on the steam rising from the kettle. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply reached for the next dish, her movements becoming stiff and mechanical, a ghost fading into the background of a house that no longer belonged to her. Spring turned to summer, and summer faded into the gray chill of winter 4 times over. Outside the front door, the neighborhood changed. Lawns were re-landscaped, cars were traded for newer models, and children grew tall enough to ride bicycles down the street. Inside, the clock on the mantel was the only thing that moved with purpose. Elena kept the windows polished to a mirror finish, ensuring the house looked perfect to anyone passing by. She polished the brass handle until her reflection distorted in the metal. She vacuumed the same rugs until the fibers wore thin. The house was a pristine stage, but the curtains were always drawn tight against the sun. Gary maintained the illusion of a happy marriage with the neighbors, offering pleasantries and handshakes at the fence line. Once the door clicked shut, the silence returned, heavier than before. She became a fixture in the architecture, as static and silent as the furniture she dusted daily. She stopped checking the mail. She stopped looking at the calendar. 4 years compressed into a single, repetitive loop of waking, cleaning, and waiting for the sun to set. The walls did not move, but they seemed to pull closer, narrowing the space she was allowed to occupy until she barely existed at all. The bathroom door was the only lock she dared to turn. Elena stepped inside, the tile cold against her bare feet, and clicked the switch. The vanity light hummed, casting a sickly yellow glow over the small, cramped space. She leaned over the porcelain basin and gripped the edges, her knuckles aching from the pressure. She looked up into the mirror. The glass was clouded with water spots, but the image it held was clear enough to be terrifying. She traced the line of her own jaw with a trembling finger, searching for the strength that had once carried her across hundreds of miles of sand and heat. She looked for the eyes that had stared down death on a boat in the middle of a dark ocean. Instead, she saw a ghost. The skin was sallow, the shoulders slumped, and the gaze was hollow, drained of every spark of recognition. She reached out, pressing her palm flat against the cold surface of the glass, trying to feel the pulse of the person she used to be. There was no response. The woman in the reflection did not blink. She was a shell, a fragile thing held together by habit, slowly dissolving into the silence of the house. Elena pulled her hand back, the sting of the cold air sharp against her skin, and stared until the edges of her vision began to blur. The silence in the bathroom was interrupted. A heavy thud sounded from the hallway, followed by the rhythmic, impatient pace of Gary moving toward the bedroom. Elena did not flinch. For the first time in 4 years, the sound did not make her heart hammer against her ribs. It made her jaw tighten. She watched her own reflection, waiting for the tears to come, but her eyes remained dry. The heat that had once helped her survive the desert sun ignited in her chest, sharp and steady. It was not a flicker of hope, but a burn of pure, unadulterated resolve. She straightened her spine, the vertebrae clicking into place. She stopped gripping the basin and let her hands hang loose at her sides, her fingers curling into fists. The victim in the glass vanished, replaced by a woman who remembered exactly what she had endured to get here. She had crossed oceans and deserts to live, not to wither in a room controlled by a man who mistook her silence for weakness. The air in the room felt different now, less like a cage, more like a waiting area. She took a long, deep breath, inhaling the stale air and exhaling the last remnants of her fear. She turned away from the mirror, her movements deliberate, and stepped toward the door. The era of bowing her head was over. Elena stepped out of the front door into the biting evening wind. She did not look back at the house. She walked 3 miles, her pace rapid, her eyes locked on a point in the distance. When she reached the gym, the neon sign above flickered, casting a harsh blue light over the sidewalk. She stopped. Her knees felt weak, and her breath came in short, jagged bursts. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to tuck them into her pockets to hide the movement. She stared at the scratched metal surface of the door. The sound of muffled thuds and rhythmic breathing leaked from within, a heartbeat of raw effort that made her own chest tighten. Every instinct she had developed over the last 4 years screamed at her to turn around and run back to the safety of the known. She reached for the handle. The cold steel bit into her palm. She squeezed, forcing her knuckles white, and planted her feet firmly on the concrete. She counted to 3. On the final beat, she threw her weight against the door. It groaned, swung inward, and she stepped out of the shadow of her past and into the blinding, fluorescent glare of the gym. The gym smelled of sweat, old leather, and floor wax. Elena stood near the entrance, a ghost in a room full of kinetic energy. Men and women moved with a rhythm she did not yet understand, their movements sharp and purposeful. She walked past the rows of equipment until she reached a heavy bag hanging from a thick, rusted chain. It swayed slightly, a pendulum of dead weight. Elena looked at her hands. They were trembling. She raised them, forming fists that felt alien and clumsy. She took a breath, expanding her lungs until they burned, and planted her feet shoulder-width apart. She did not know how to throw a punch, but she knew how to strike back. She stepped forward, shifting her weight, and drove her right hand into the center of the leather bag. The impact jarred her shoulder and sent a shockwave up her arm. The bag groaned under the force. In that split second, the tension that had coiled around her throat for years snapped. The sound of the glove hitting the heavy surface was loud, final, and absolute. She did not stop. She pulled her arm back and hit it again, then again, feeling the resistance meet her strength. The chains rattled overhead, a metallic scream that echoed her own internal release. The walk home was a blur of cold air and adrenaline. Elena reached the front door and paused, checking her reflection in the dark glass. Her skin was flushed, her pulse still hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stepped inside, the silence of the house pressing against her ears. Gary was in the living room, his back to her, the television casting a flickering blue light across the walls. She moved to the bathroom, locking the door with a soft click. She scrubbed her face and neck, rinsing away the scent of sweat and leather, replacing it with the synthetic floral soap he preferred. She inspected her knuckles in the mirror. They were red, slightly swollen, a secret map of her new existence. She pulled her hair forward to shield her face before stepping out. She entered the kitchen, her movements practiced and submissive, keeping her head low as she began to prepare dinner. Gary did not turn around, but he sniffed the air, a sharp, questioning sound that made her heart skip a beat. She stood still, hands gripping the edge of the counter until her fingers ached. She was living two lives now, and the gap between them was widening every single day. Every afternoon became a battlefield of repetition. Elena arrived at the gym while the sun was still high, shedding the identity of a submissive wife at the door. She stopped looking at the bag as an enemy. She looked at it as a vessel for everything she had buried. When she threw a jab, she channeled the memory of the insults he threw at her heritage. When she followed with a hook, she channeled the isolation of the last 4 years. Her knuckles split and bled, but she wrapped them in tape and kept going. The trainer stood by, calling out sequences that forced her to move her hips, to rotate her core, to find the power that had been dormant since she crossed the border. She stopped gasping for air and started breathing rhythmically, a steady intake that fueled every explosive movement. Her shoulders broadened, and the constant tension in her jaw began to ease, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. The heavy bag took the brunt of her history, swinging wildly as she unleashed combinations that grew faster and more precise with every session. She was no longer just hitting leather, she was dismantling the fear that had defined her existence. By the time the final bell rang, her body was slick with sweat, but for the first time, she felt entirely, undeniably solid. The key turned in the lock with a metallic click that sounded louder than usual. Elena stepped into the hallway, her stride measured and her shoulders squared. She did not immediately head for the kitchen or look at the floor. In the living room, Gary sat in his armchair, his eyes tracing her path with calculated intensity. He paused his television, the sudden silence in the room heavy and electric. He leaned forward, his chair groaning under his weight, watching the way she held her head. She moved to the table, her motions fluid, lacking the hesitant twitching that once defined her presence. Gary reached for his glass, his movements slow, deliberate, a test of her reaction. He waited for her to flinch, to look away, to offer the usual apology for her lateness. She did neither. She stood by the counter, eyes fixed on the wall, her breathing steady and deep. He stood up, the floorboards creaking under his boots, and walked toward her. He stopped just inside her personal space, expecting her to shrink back, but she held her ground, her stance balanced and firm. He searched her face for the familiar flicker of fear, but found only a cold, impenetrable calm. The power dynamic in the house had shifted. and for the first time, Gary did not know how to reclaim the lead. The gym lights were harsh, but they felt like home compared to the dim, suffocating quiet of her kitchen. Elena stood before the mirror, tracing the new definition in her arms, not as a badge of athletic prowess, but as a map of her own recovery. She realized then that she was not training for a trophy, a belt, or the applause of a crowd. She was training to reclaim the pieces of herself that she had surrendered for a false sense of safety. Every strike she practiced was a reclamation project. Her hooks were not meant for opponents. They were meant to break the mental chains that kept her voice small and her spirit tethered to a life she no longer owned. She felt the strength in her core, a solid, unyielding center that no threat could displace. The fear that once paralyzed her had been burned away by the relentless rhythm of the bag. She was shedding the ghost she had become, replacing the silence of the house with the steady rhythmic heartbeat of a woman who knew her own worth. She stopped searching for external salvation and started building her own sanctuary. Her soul was no longer a casualty of her circumstances. It was the weapon that would secure her freedom. The silence inside the house was no longer empty. It was heavy with the weight of things unsaid. Elena walked through the rooms, noticing details she had been too afraid to see for years. The dust on the mantel, the uneven floorboards, the way the shadows gathered in the corners like waiting spectators. She did not rush. She moved with a deliberate, quiet precision that seemed to irritate the very air around her. Gary paced the hallway, his footsteps erratic, a sharp contrast to her grounded presence. He stopped by the doorway, watching her pour water into a glass. He waited for a tremor in her hand, a sign of the old instability. But her grip was steady. He moved to the sink, deliberately bumping her shoulder, a clumsy attempt to reassert his spatial dominance. She simply stepped aside, her movement fluid and effortless, as if he were nothing more than a passing breeze. He stopped pacing, his chest heaving, his eyes searching for a crack in her composure. She looked at the window, watching the light fade from the sky, her heartbeat calm and rhythmic. The house felt smaller, the walls pressing inward, vibrating with the tension of a storm that was finally ready to break. The kitchen light hummed, a shrill, flickering sound that punctuated the sudden shift in the room. Gary blocked the doorway, his presence filling the narrow space, his jaw tight. He stepped into her path, forcing her to stop. He leaned in, his voice dropping to that familiar, jagged whisper that once turned her blood to ice. He started the list, the threats about her status, the reminders of her supposed worthlessness, the casual cruelties meant to strip away her confidence. He paced around her, a predator circling a cornered animal, waiting for the familiar slump of her shoulders or the shine of tears. He reached out, gripping the edge of the counter near her hand, his knuckles white, his eyes darting to catch any flicker of terror. He demanded she look at him, his voice rising in volume, demanding the submission he had grown accustomed to for years. But the air in the room did not bend to his will. The heat of his anger struck the wall of her resolve and stalled. He stopped mid-sentence, his brow furrowed, confused by the lack of recoil. Elena stood still, her breathing deep and rhythmic, her hands resting flat against the table. She was not trembling. For the first time, his words felt like echoes in a canyon, distant and entirely powerless against the silence she held. Gary took a half step forward, his face twisting into a mask of frustration as he realized his usual tactics were hitting nothing but air. He pushed his face inches from hers, his breath hot and ragged, trying to force the panic he needed to see. He shouted a string of insults, his hands balling into fists at his sides, his body vibrating with the effort to regain his lost dominance. He expected her to flinch. He expected her to collapse. Instead, Elena did the one thing he was completely unprepared for. She turned her head. She did not look at the floor. She did not look at the door. She locked her eyes onto his and refused to let go. Her gaze was not angry. It was clinical, cold, and entirely devoid of the fear he had relied on for years. The effect was immediate. Gary stumbled back as if he had been struck. The words died in his throat, replaced by a sudden, jagged gasp. He blinked, his eyes darting across her face, searching for the ghost he had spent 4 years creating. She remained perfectly still, her pulse steady, her focus unwavering. The silence that followed was heavy, a vacuum that sucked the oxygen out of the room. He stood frozen, his mouth half open, staring at a woman he no longer recognized. Gary opened his mouth, a reflexive sound of indignation forming, but the air escaped before a word could follow. He shifted his weight, his heels clicking against the linoleum, a desperate attempt to reclaim the space between them. He raised a finger, pointing it like an accusation, but his hand shook. Elena did not wait for his recovery. She stepped forward, closing the distance he had tried to maintain, her posture rigid and unyielding. She drew a breath, the sound sharp and deliberate in the quiet kitchen. When she spoke, her voice was not a whisper, it was a blade. "You used my fear to build your prison," she said, each syllable landing with the weight of a stone. She kept her eyes fixed on his, watching the flicker of confusion turn into the first sign of genuine alarm. "But I was a survivor long before I met you." The kitchen felt smaller, the walls pulling inward, yet she stood tall, her presence eclipsing his entirely. He retreated a step, his back hitting the refrigerator, the metallic thud echoing through the house. He looked at her, searching for the shadow he had kept in check, but found only steel. She had stripped the weapon from his hand simply by refusing to be the target he had defined. Gary reached out, his hand trembling, fingers clawing at the empty air as if trying to grasp the authority he had lost. He stammered, his voice cracking, trying to remind her of the papers, the authorities, the life he claimed he had provided. Elena did not let him finish. She held up one hand, palm out, a simple, firm gesture that halted his words instantly. She took a slow, measured step toward him, forcing him to shrink back against the cold appliance behind him. She looked at him, not with hate, but with the hollow detachment one might reserve for a relic of a forgotten life. She leaned in, her voice low and steady, carrying the weight of her final resolution. "And I will be a survivor long after I leave you," she stated. The threat of the authorities, the fear of the unknown, the weight of the last 4 years had all evaporated in the space between them. Gary's mouth moved, but no sound came out. He was no longer the architect of her reality. He was merely a man standing in a kitchen, watching his control dissolve. She turned away, her movements precise and unhurried. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. She walked toward the threshold, leaving him trapped in the silence of his own making. Elena crossed the threshold of the kitchen, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor with a finality that made the air feel thin. She did not pack a bag. She did not look for keys. She walked toward the front door, her pace steady and rhythmic. Behind her, Gary found his voice, a sharp, ragged sound that cracked in the quiet hallway. "You have nowhere to go," he shouted, the words desperate and thin. She did not stop. She did not turn her head. His voice was just noise now, a distant vibration that could no longer reach her. She reached the door, her hand closing around the cold brass knob. It turned with a smooth mechanical click. She pushed. The heavy door swung outward, revealing the dark, vast expanse of the street. The cool night air rushed in, hitting her face, smelling of rain and asphalt, the scent of freedom. She stepped across the threshold and onto the porch. The world was wide and silent. She pulled the door shut behind her, the heavy thud of the latch locking into place, signaling the end of her life as a hostage. She walked down the steps, into the dark, and never looked back. The basement gym became her cathedral, but the professional ring became her stage. Elena moved with a new, terrifying efficiency. The rhythm of the speed bag blurred into a constant metallic hum. She traded the silence of her former life for the sharp percussive cracks of leather against leather. Her first professional bout was a blur of lights and adrenaline. She stood in the center of the canvas, her breathing rhythmic and controlled, looking across at an opponent who saw only a target. Elena saw a puzzle to be solved. She dodged, pivoted, and struck with the precision of a woman who had spent years calculating every exit. The crowd noise rose, a wall of sound that vibrated through the floorboards, but she heard only her own heart. She won by decision, then by knockout, then by sheer relentless pressure. The headlines changed. From a ghost in a kitchen she emerged as a technician of force. Her hands, once raw from the desert, were now wrapped in white tape and determination. She fought every month, climbing the rankings with a cold, calculated hunger. Each victory was a brick pulled from the wall of her past. She was no longer surviving, she was conquering. The headlines about her title fights soon shifted focus. Journalists stopped asking about her technique and started asking about her history. Elena became a face on television screens in living rooms across the country. Her name appeared on posters in community centers and subway stations. Every morning, her mailbox overflowed with handwritten notes. She would sit at her desk, sorting through envelopes stained with tears and marked with gratitude. One letter arrived from a woman in a town 3 states away, detailing a plan to leave a life of confinement, just like the one Elena had escaped. The message was simple. Because you stood up, I finally realized I could too. Elena answered these letters by hand, her pen moving across the paper with the same steady discipline she applied to her hooks and jabs. She began speaking at shelters, standing on stages under bright hot lights. She did not talk about fame. She talked about the mechanics of breaking chains. Thousands of women looked at her and stopped seeing a boxer. They saw a mirror of their own dormant strength. The movement grew not through speeches, but through the quiet, physical act of one person daring to walk away. She was no longer just a fighter, she was a beacon. The world saw the champion, but in the quiet hours after the training, Elena finally met someone who looked past the gloves. They met at a charity event for survivors, not in a dark corner, but under bright, open lights. He did not lean in to whisper threats or measure her worth by her silence. When they spoke, he leaned back, giving her space to occupy the room. He asked about her technique, her discipline, and the way she analyzed her opponents. He watched her matches not to control her, but to marvel at her movement. One evening, as they shared a meal, he noticed her hand trembling from the day's heavy sparring and simply poured her a glass of water without a word of mockery. There was no demand for her to cook, no demand for her to shrink, and no mention of her past as a weapon. He thrived on her intensity. He pushed her to analyze her own goals and respected the boundaries she set with a firm, steady hand. Elena realized that for the first time, she was not being measured by what she could provide, but by who she was. She was no longer a puzzle to be solved or a hostage to be held. She was an equal. The championship belts gathered dust on the shelf, and the new partner walked through the front door. But Elena knew the real work had happened long before the applause. She stood in the center of her gym, the air thick with the smell of sweat and old leather. She looked at her reflection in the full-length mirror, not searching for a ghost or a prisoner, but acknowledging the woman who had walked through the desert and out of the cage. The ring had been a testing ground, and the relationship had been a sanctuary, but neither was the source of her light. She gripped the edge of the heavy bag, feeling the rough texture against her palms, and remembered the first time she struck it. She realized then that the victory was not in the trophies or the support of another person. It was in the silence of that realization. She had spent years looking for a savior in the eyes of others, waiting for someone to grant her permission to exist. She finally understood that the person she had been waiting for was already there. She was her own savior. She had been the one to tighten her own laces. She had been the one to plant her feet in the mud. She was the architect of her own rescue. Elena's journey leaves us with a heavy question about the price we pay for a roof over our heads. We often mistake the absence of conflict for the presence of stability. We cling to the familiar, even when it demands we shrink our own existence to fit into the corners of another person's life. We tell ourselves that staying put is the responsible choice, the mature path, the way to keep the world from falling apart. But at what point does that stability become a slow-motion burial? Is a cage truly a home just because the door is locked from the inside? When you trade your voice for silence and your boundaries for a sense of belonging, you are not building a life. You are managing a decline. Think about the spaces you occupy today. Are you there because you are growing, or are you there because you are afraid of the cost of leaving? Does the promise of security hold any real value if the cost is the total loss of your own dignity? Is staying for the sake of stability ever worth the erosion of your soul, or is leaving the only path to actual survival? Your perspective matters, because your experience might be the exact lifeline someone else is waiting for. If you have ever felt the walls of your own life closing in, you know that the most dangerous thing you can do is stay silent. Take a moment right now to scroll down to the comments and share your truth. Does staying for the sake of stability feel like a trap? Or have you found a way to reclaim your dignity while remaining in place? Your voice is a tool for change. Beyond the comments, look at the people in your life today. Is there someone who is currently shrinking themselves to fit into a situation that offers them no growth? Send this story to them immediately. Do not wait for a better time or a perfect moment to bridge that gap. A simple message can be the catalyst that helps someone realize they possess the power to walk away from their own cage. Hit the like button to signal that this message of survival needs to reach more people. By sharing this, you are not just spreading a story. You are helping build a network of support for those who are still learning that they are their own best hope. Every story of survival carries a blueprint for your own liberation. Elena walked away from a life that demanded her silence. And in doing so, she reminded us all that the most important relationship you will ever cultivate is the one you have with your own strength. Do not settle for the safety of a cage when the horizon belongs to those who dare to move. You are the architect of your own boundaries and the only one who can grant yourself permission to leave. The next chapter of your life is waiting for you to turn the page. To see another testament of resilience and the courage it takes to start over, click the card appearing on your screen right now. That video holds the next step in your own journey toward reclaiming your voice. Watch it, absorb the lessons, and carry that momentum into your own life. Remember that your survival is not just an event, it is a continuous, daily act of choosing yourself. Thank you for listening, for sharing, and for standing in your power. I will be waiting for you in the next story. See you there.